Omnibus Press is the largest publisher, exclusive publisher of books about rock and pop music in the world. Over the years, since the company was formed in the late 70s, we've probably published over 1,000 books about rock and pop music. Some photo books, some substantial biographies with over 400 or 500 pages, some slimmer volumes on lesser acts. We try to maintain an output of between 25 and 30 books a year, almost all of them new, almost all of them commissioned and edited by myself or my colleague David Barraclough. Over the years, Omnibus has published some of the best books, that are best rock and pop biographies that have ever been. Some of the early books included Pete Frame's Rock Family Trees. We signed up Pete to do books of his Rock Family Trees in the early 80s, and we've now got 5 specific books on Pete. Amongst our best books was Keith Moon, Dear Boy, The Life of Keith Moon by Tony Fletcher, which has now sold, I think, in excess of 80,000 copies. Also The Severed Alliance by Johnny Rogan, which was his take on the story of the Smiths. Some of our other books that have done particularly well include Bright Lights, Dark Shadows, The Story of ABBA, which was written by a Stockholm-based writer called Carl Magnus Palm, who is really the world's authority on Bjorn, Anni-Frid, Agneta, and Benny. More recently, our biographies of Kate Bush and George Harrison, both written by Graham Thompson, have done exceptionally well and got terrific reviews. Omnibus Press is part of the Music Sales group of companies, and Music Sales is the biggest publisher of printed sheet music in Europe and the second biggest in the world. Omnibus, as a general rule, doesn't go in for authorized biographies by very famous rock stars, partly because we like to maintain our own editorial stance and not have to publish what we're told to publish. As well as the biographies, Omnibus publishes a lot of large format photo books. Along the way, we acquired a company called Vision On, which specialized in these kinds of books. And when we'd acquired that company, we decided to develop these ideas. So we've got picture books on the Beatles, we've got picture books on Led Zeppelin, picture books more recently on one on Keith Richards. After 30 years of doing this job and commissioning and editing all these rock books, I long ago realized that just because a group is very, very popular and famous, it won't necessarily sell books. Often it means, or what sells a book is the story and whether or not the artist is interesting. For example, The Severed Alliance, the Smiths book written by Johnny Rogan, was enormously successful. We sold 50,000, 60,000 copies of that book within 2 or 3 years. Simultaneously, I think we published a book on Dire Straits. Now, I have nothing against Dire Straits or Mark Knopfler as a guitar player. He's a brilliant guitar player. But he's not very interesting. Mark Knopfler has never said anything other than, what a nice guitar he's just bought. Whereas Morrissey, of course, is very controversial and he's upsetting people left, right and centre. He may or may not be gay. He's certainly following in the tradition of Oscar Wilde. He likes to wind people up. He's a militant vegetarian. He wanted to execute Margaret Thatcher. So this is the sort of thing that is controversial, and this sells books. Now, Dire Straits probably outsold the Smiths 3-4 to 1 in terms of record sales, but in terms of book sales, Smiths outsold Dire Straits by about 10 to 1. Interestingly enough, too, later in the 90s, I did a substantial book on the Spice Girls, which did very badly in the marketplace, I'm afraid, because people weren't interested in reading about the Spice Girls. That same year, I published a book on Hawkwind, the sort of hippie group from the 60s who were led by Dave Brock. And the Hawkwind book outsold the Spice Girls book by about 3 to 1. Meanwhile, the Spice Girls record sales were outselling Hawkwind 20 to 1. So just because an artist sells a lot of records does not necessarily mean they'll sell a lot of books. They have to be a fascinating artist, it has to be an interesting artist, and preferably controversial as well.